Hello, thank you very much for joining our talk today. My name is Galloway and this is Timur Yunusov, and we're going to be talking about payment technologies and the security risks associated with them. So the reason why we came up with this talk is because we both work with payment technologies every day, and all of us in this room, we interact with payments every day as well. And we realized that for something that we all interact with so often, it's actually quite a complex ecosystem, which is quite difficult for most people to understand. So we thought it would be really great if we could shed a little bit of light on what's really going on in payments and the security risks associated with them. So with that in mind, I thought I would mention a few reasons why we are qualified to do that. So the first reason is that we were both born in the 80s, which means that we were born approximately 20 years after the first cash dispenser was installed in London by Barclays Bank. That also means that we've suffered through the introduction of many new payment technologies along the way. Last year, we bought an ATM and deconstructed it completely. And when I say completely, I mean right down to the safe, which was a very interesting experience for us. So we work actively with payment technologies, and we're really interested in carrying out research in this specific area. But like you, we also interact with payments every day. So as I mentioned, we started from the idea that the payment ecosystem is an extremely complex place. And if you look at this image here, you can see that it seems quite overwhelming. But all this is representative of a number of different payment systems. And what those do are they simply just facilitate the ability to transfer funds from one individual to another. And for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be talking about regulated money, so we're not talking about cryptocurrency. But if I break it down into three components, it makes it quite a bit easier to understand. So first of all, we have payment instruments, so that's things like paper money and checks. Then we have card payments, so anything from chip and pin, swiped, keyed entry of the PAN number. Then we have payment system operators, so that's banks, clearing houses, and credit unions. And then payment delivery methods. Payment delivery methods are really the endpoint of these systems, and they're the part that we interact with most every day. So that's point of sales terminals, payment gateways, so if you're making a payment online, and ATMs. So for this presentation, we'll be primarily focused on the endpoints of these systems. And the reason for that is in security, as security researchers, this is the first point of interaction for many of us because it's relatively easy for us to obtain access to these devices. It gives us some information about the system, and payment system operators like banks essentially operate like a black box. So it's quite difficult as a security researcher to begin there, unless you happen to work in a bank. Another thing is that criminals typically focus their attention on this area first. So that's why we will be focusing on ATMs, point of sales terminals, and we'll also be focusing on card payments themselves.
Yeah, so even really first ATM was installed, how we heard, like 51 years ago. Not too many things significantly changed in the last 50 years, even though now it's like almost 4 million ATMs operating all over the world. And by changing, I mean from a security perspective. So just quick overview of main ATM parts for interactions, for criminals, and like from a customer's perspective. So three main parts is a service area, which contains computer, monitor, card reader, and crypto keyboard, so main point of interaction with the customer. Then we have vault, which contains cash dispenser with from 4 to 6 different cassettes for each types of notes. And behind this, there is a network which which work to communicate ATMs with bank and so on. And really interesting that the fact is that cryptography is probably the major basic thing in all payment technologies in every bank. For example, in ATM, maybe crypto keyboard is the most secure part of ATM in the end, as well as, for example, encrypted connection to Visa network. But sometimes even bank does not understand properly their ATM's ecosystem, how complex it might be. For example, not every bank will understand that if hacker will get access to one ATM, he could get access to every ATMs in network and control them and spit out money from all of them. Or, for example, in fact, whole banking network get access to internals and do something else. As well as vice versa, for example, when hacker can infect some endpoint computer in a bank, like operator workstation. It's just a question of time at what time he will get access. He could get access to every ATM in this particular bank. So let's make an overview of modern ATM attacks. And I will not be speaking about how it calls brute force, so we'll not be speaking about gas, dynamite, and so on. We'll speak about more sophisticated and logical things. So first of all is interaction with operating system level, which brings us to attacks well known as jackpotting, when hackers run their own malware to spit out money. Second is about hardware attacks, also known as black box attacks, when hackers communicate directly with cash dispenser without any communication with computer. And third is kind of misconfigurations and vulnerabilities which could be contained in network, ATM's network. So this is a very great example for us. Here is an instruction available in dark web which says where exactly hacker have to drill small holes to get direct access to USB port and insert their keyboard and mouse, for example. And which means if we are speaking still about Windows operating system, which is operate like 90% of ATMs all over the world. It's like, you can be even a cat to get, if you have access to keyboard and mouse, to run your own piece of malware. If cats can do this. Of course, that's why there are typically several layers of protection. For example, not every ATM will allow you to plug in your keyboard and mouse. Next, it is some kind of restriction which calls kiosk mode, which restrict operators to get full access to Explorer, for example, to Shell itself, and even to File Manager, which surprisingly installed on like 99% of ATMs, and some other protections. But in the end, if you will be able to bypass these protections...
Screen or a screen you would see on an ATM, all I need to do is utilizing some keys on the keyboard is I can use some key combinations to gain access to the operating system.
So here we run our crafted piece of malware and getting our nodes. So it's pretty easy. And of course it made complete sense because computer should send these commands by default to peripherals, to cash dispenser, to get money via specially crafted most of the time API which calls MSXFS, surprisingly created by Microsoft. And that's why when these attacks started to appear, major ATM vendors implemented next level of protection. Mostly it is application control tools presented by major vendors like Kaspersky, McAfee, Trend Micro, Checkpoint. So instead of normal antiviruses, which works with signature-based or behavior analysis, they create whitelists and blacklists. So after being installed, this software create whitelist of pre-installed applications on this moment, and everything which want to be launched afterwards, which is not in whitelist, will be blocked. But there are several problems. First of all, this software will not work from the box. It will not work. It should be very slightly set up. It should be configured and configured very properly for every specific ATM. And this happens almost never. And second, in the last 5 years, you all might seen that even major security vendors which create security software, they all make mistakes. For example, in the last couple of years, we found like around 5 0 days in all type of these products, and of course not only us, our colleagues as well. So black box, yeah. Instead of drilling holes and plugging in keyboards and mouses, hackers can drill in other places, also holes, and connect directly to cash dispenser instead of computer. Yeah, and send command via COM or USB to get money. For these purposes, you may need specially crafted hardware with Arduino, for example, on board, or you can use small laptop and hold it inside of service area if you get access to keys to service area, which is surprisingly also not very hard. This attack first was described in 2013 by Barnaby Jack, and since that, all ATM vendors implemented their own security, which was surprisingly cryptography, which means they built secure layer of connection between computer and cash dispenser. But they didn't do this very well. So first we sent this attack to NCR in 2013 of their poor implementation of the security mechanisms. And in 2017, they still met a lot of problems. In this year, on a Black Hat, we'll present a presentation about breaking black box security in major vendors like NCR and WinCore. But I will briefly describe what happened. So in summer, we and our colleagues from other security companies sent several emails to NCR by saying, guys, your encryption is not very well. It contains a lot of problems. But they were saying us, no, we are all right. Videos you sending us looks like fraud bullshit. Until in September of 2017, real incident happened in Mexico when hackers actually used this misconfiguration, this vulnerability, or I don't know, this backdoor, wherever, and got access to money in one bank. And surprisingly, afterwards, in February of 2018, NCR presented new, completely secure version of protection against black box. But in the end, that means that even the major solution from ATM vendors against black box is you need to buy completely new ATM and throw out all your 5,000 ATMs park of old ATMs. It will not give you 100% guarantee against this attack. And last story, you all probably seen this somewhere in your life when you see sticking out from ATM some RG45 cables, going somewhere to network devices and somewhere else. Which means hackers, for example, also can connect to these wires and, for example, use vulnerabilities of Windows, yeah, which would be probably installed in the ATM. Or in worst case scenario, basically just substitute the answer from a processing center by saying, don't give me A nodes from cassette B, give me C nodes from cassette D. Yeah, and in theory, everything should be, of course, protected with controlling checksums, with cryptography, but honestly, it works very well when we are speaking about outdoor ATMs installed on the street, somewhere else. But when we are speaking about ATMs in a bank branch, this might happen not all the time. And I will share you one very interesting story which happened with us like 2 months ago. We had ATM Security Assessment project, and network connection were working via GSM industrial modem, which were held in service area. And after the main part of project, we were speaking with bank by saying, guys, do you want us to make an assessment to check out this vector? Yeah, how we can actually use one compromised ATM, which we compromised in the end, and get access to all your network? And they said, oh, no, we're all right. We have everything. We have all security policies. Firewall will not allow you to do this. Everything is isolated from each other. And we said, okay, let's go for it then. And 48 hours later, surprisingly, what happened? It turned out that this GSM modem were using its own proprietary VPN, which was working like end-to-end tunnel with their own two binaries, the same identical binaries on the server and client side, and these binaries contained remote code execution. And 48 hours later, we got access to HTML page, which said us, here is IP-rated ATMs, you can choose and get access to this ATM remotely. Was very good until we realized that it was not the network of bank, it was a network of engineer company, service provider, which were maintaining like 12 banks in a very big city. So we were able to get access to every ATM of these two banks in this big city. Yeah. Why this happens and all over the world? Yeah, of course, I'm not speaking about Asia, about Eastern Europe. This happens a lot in Europe, in Western Europe, in London, in England, and this year this also started to happen in USA, for example. So why attacks on ATM growing up from year to year? Yeah. Well, first of all, as Leon already mentioned, sometimes it's quite easy to buy your own ATM, yeah, and start to build your own hacking camp for your criminal things, and end up with being one of these famous hackers who actually steal money from ATMs. Yeah, and second, hackers are pretty lazy still. Yeah, criminals are pretty lazy, and they wait until this market will appear, until you can just basically go to dark web and buy and download step-by-step instructions how to infect any ATM in your city. Until they wait, this piece of software will appear, which helps them to make these jackpotting attacks, which will allow them to use even second-factor authentication against mules who want to rob them more. So this is the major problem, that this market, dark market, gives a lot of possibilities to criminals these days.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about card payments. And we're going to focus specifically on cardholder present transactions. So those are chip and PIN, chip and signature, keyed entry of the primary account number, and any contactless payments as well. So although contactless doesn't have additional cardholder verification, it is considered a cardholder present transaction. So what happens when you make a transaction? So typically you might go into a shop or a business and you'd be paying for some services or goods, and you'd either hand your card to the business holder or they would ask you to touch the terminal. At that point, your information is sent to their acquiring bank. They don't know who your bank is at this point, so they ask your card brand to then determine who your issuing bank is. They will make some initial checks just to see if you have enough credit facility and to see if they're happy with you making the payment. They'll then send this information all the way back along the chain. So it seems relatively simple so far. But if we look a bit deeper, so in this case, this is a representation of a NFC payment, you can see that it's quite a bit more complicated. But honestly, for the purposes of understanding many of the security risks associated with card payments, you don't need to understand the exact steps that a transaction makes. So firstly, let me talk about chip and PIN. So chip and PIN isn't so widely used in the US, but it is used for almost all transactions in Europe. And it was hailed as a security solution to many of the issues associated with swiped transactions. I think we all know that it's relatively simple to clone the magnetic stripe data of a card and then to forge someone's signature. It's almost child's play, in fact. So chip and PIN was meant to be the most secure form of authorization, so the most secure version of authenticating the cardholder. But unfortunately, there's quite a number of issues with it. So in 2010, researchers from Aperture Labs in Europe, they found that specifically for SDA cards, if you were to make a transaction in offline mode with a terminal, there are two possible outcomes. The first is that you could intercept the PIN in clear text. Not very good so far. And secondly is you can bypass PIN verification altogether. So that does away with the cardholder verification. It also means that you can steal someone's card, and for a limited period of time before the bank blocks you, you can make transactions in what's considered the most secure form. So that doesn't sound very good, but actually, from a criminal's perspective, there's a much easier target, and that's NFC. So if we look at NFC, it was first used for transport systems. So it was first used by the UPass in Korea, and then in the early 2000s was adopted by their Transport for London system. And then slowly it's been integrated into payment technologies, and now it accounts for around 40% of all of our non-cash transactions. So why is this so attractive to criminals? Well, there's quite a few interesting points about contactless. The first is that it's considered an acceptable risk by banks, so they know they're going to suffer some losses from this. There's no cardholder verification, so you can intercept someone's token or take someone's card and quite easily make payments with that for a period of time before you're blocked. Also, quite interestingly, sometimes you can have a higher limit in the country with which your card was issued, and then make a payment in a country where there is a lower limit associated with transactions, and you can actually bypass that. And then lastly, it's pretty much everywhere. So for that reason, it's very, very attractive. But if we look at the kind of attack vectors that are facing contactless payments, we'll see that there's actually not so many confirmed cases in the media or by banks around this area. So in 2015, this is an article by SC Magazine, and they're talking about one of their journalists was affected by a type of fraud. But there's not really very much that's happened between 2015 and 2018 in this space, except, of course, that many researchers started publishing information on the many different issues associated with it, such as replay and relay attacks. But in the early part of this year in the UK, they actually announced that there were significant losses associated with contactless payments, which is very interesting because mostly banks don't like to admit that they have a problem. So if we take a look at the NFC attack surface area, you can see that there's lots of points of interaction if you are an attacker. So first of all, we can interact with enrollment, then anywhere between the token being issued and the terminal, and directly between the terminal and the acquiring bank as well. So let's talk about tokenization. Tokenization is meant to be a more secure way of making a payment. So what happens is when you enroll your card with a mobile wallet, it's replaced with a virtual representation of itself. You're also issued with tokens that have a limited lifetime. You shouldn't be able to use them again. But last year, Tim actually found that there were some issues with Apple Pay, specifically that for certain kinds of payments, so making payments through applications or websites, you can actually reuse the token and make another purchase. Secondly, the researcher Salvador Mendoza, he found that there were a number of issues associated with Samsung Pay, specifically that the tokens actually have quite a long lifetime associated with them. So what this means is you can intercept a token and you don't have to use it straight away. You can hold on to a bunch of tokens that you've harvested from people. So if we look at what that first point of interaction looks like between, say, the phone and the terminal, the easiest way of attacking this is really through what's called a relay attack. So in this situation, what an attacker is trying to do is they're just trying to intercept your token before you use it. So NFC uses inductive coupling. All that means is that I have to get really close to you. So one way of doing that in a very simple way is that I could have two phones, and the first phone could act as a reader. I could intercept a token from your card, from your phone. I could then send that information over a public Wi-Fi connection to another phone, which would emulate your card and make a payment. But there are more complicated ways of doing that as well. So here's an example of a more complicated version of doing that. So this is a project I was working on with the researcher Salvador Mendoza. And what it does is it uses dedicated hardware and an RF channel to transmit the information. So with this, you don't actually have any issues with using things like public Wi-Fi networks, any lag associated with that. And you can see here, so in the first instance, we are reading the card on this side. So you can see the card's been read. And then I'm going to walk to the place where the card has been read by another piece of hardware. So this is about 30 foot. And I'm just going to lift that up and you can see the card that we've read. So how have payments and fraud evolved? So firstly, as I mentioned, there's been a greater focus on contactless payments. It's a new form of technology and it doesn't have the limits, it doesn't have very high limits associated with it, but it's really easy to intercept tokens and make payments with them. But secondly, we've seen a growth in something called authorization stream attacks or authorization anomaly. And what this is really attackers looking at the different physical devices in the system as well as how the bank responds to payments that they're making to try and work out how to carry out fraud. So what they're doing is they're just trying to abuse the logic in the system. So if I give you some examples of that, it will become a bit clearer. So in the most simple form, what that looks like is, imagine if you went into a bar and you handed your card to the bartender. But instead of having just one terminal, they also had a fraudulent merchant terminal. They could touch your card against both terminals very quickly, and both of those payments would go through, and they would both be authorized by your bank. That's a completely legitimate way of making payments, but that's not how the system should be used. As an attacker, I also have the ability to intercept the transaction information between the terminal and the acquiring bank. With that, I can do things like modify the transaction values, I can modify my merchant code, And I can also do things like issue credits rather than debiting from an account. Now, you might be quite familiar with the concept of fallback, but I'll just go ahead and explain that. So, when you make a transaction in a shop, ideally your bank wants you to make the most secure version of that transaction, whatever that is, assuming it might be chip and signature or chip and PIN. That's the ideal scenario. As an attacker, what I can do is I can just force the card and terminal to try and make the transaction in a less secure form. And it's much easier than you think. So I can just insert my card upside down, sometimes once, sometimes a couple of times, and then it typically will ask you to swipe your card, at which point you can swipe the card and fake the signature. Another interesting example is that it's possible to intercept the track2 equivalent data from a contactless token and write that information to the magnetic stripe on a card. You can then use that completely legitimately to make a payment. Then we have another interesting use of the terminal itself. So if you were to go into a shop and make a payment, if the merchant gives you the terminal in your hand, there's typically a short window in time between the actual synchronization of the transaction to the acquiring bank and actually the transaction being made. So what this means is I have the possibility to manipulate the terminal itself. And you can actually reset the operating system, which means that you would be issued with a receipt. It looks like you've paid for the goods, but the transaction actually never takes place. And lastly, so this example of an attack actually occurred for real in 2016. A bank in the UK was hit by something called a credit master attack, and they lost 2.5 million, which is a significant amount. So banks are really terrified by this form of attack, primarily because it has the ability to just completely financially cripple them. So what this is that attackers are looking to predict and brute force the entire bin ranges of cards, sometimes before they've even been issued. So that sounds like it's quite complicated, because you would also need to understand the information associated with the cardholder, things like the name and address, the expiry date, and the security code. But as it turns out, it's not quite as complicated as that, because typically if you're trying to make a payment with this kind of information, you'll be doing it through things like websites. You won't be doing it in person. And often, those websites won't check all of that information. So immediately, you have less information to guess. And researchers at Cambridge University actually found that if you distribute the guesses against different websites, different merchants' websites, it is possible to do this within a few thousand guesses.
Yeah, and as for the end, let's try to quickly also find an answer for the question why hackers will try to steal $100 from 1,000 people if they actually can just steal 100 million at a time, right? So in 2018, hackers, probably all of them, already understand that it's quite easy to get access to banking internals network via phishing or compromising of web servers or other network devices. And afterwards, if hackers are already inside, it's just a matter of time and a matter of final aim. They can get access to ATM network, and as happened in Thailand and Taiwan a couple of years ago, they can get access to banking processing, get access to all track2 data, and start to do things which Lian described a couple minutes ago. Or in this case scenario, they can get access to interbanking exchange network called as SWIFT. So in the last 5 years, there were around 10 attacks on different banks all over the world, with a lot of money were stolen, where maximum was around 80 millions a time, $8 million. But the question is that Swift actually says, guys, this is your problem, this is bank problem, that you don't have completely air-gapped Swift infrastructure against the rest of internal things. You got hackers get into your system, compromise your servers. What do you expect from us? Our software is completely secure. Our terminal does not contain any vulnerabilities. Our network also is secured with VPNs, a lot of layers of protections and things like that. This is your problem that, like, after infection of some of your terminals and points via phishing, it's just a matter of time, yeah, how hackers just mitigate pivoting via networks, and a couple months later, somehow your Swift server and Swift terminal was infected. What did you expect afterwards? Of course, 2 months later, you will be compromised. This is just an example from one of our security investigation in one of our bank. Remember how I told you that hackers are lazy, yeah? And they are lazy, like 99% of them are. But it is a small amount of criminals, black hackers, who actually do also their own security researches. Yeah, they buy ATMs, and in this case, they somehow get access to Swift server via, I don't know, fired employees. Yeah, they got access to Swift internals, made some kind of their own research, and create their own malware dynamic library of Swift network, which allowed them, what they allowed them to do. They allowed them to substitute, to tamper the correction of signatures, so operator on the screen sees that, yeah, all operations were confirmed by me or by someone else, checksum is all right. We can send it next to Swift network. As well as they can even tamper information on a printer, sent on a printer for visual confirmation, and the same result will be achieved. And of course, afterwards, hackers would easily get access to that 100 millions and easy steal them. So let's try to find an answer what to do with these interesting stories.
Am I giving the answer now? Yeah. So we've talked about quite a few different examples here. Many of them are just the tip of the iceberg, really, for what we're working with. And one of the main reasons why this happens is because we are seeing many different technologies that are layered together, and banks don't typically understand how these things work in practice. So the only real solution to all of the security issues we've shown you is that live testing has to be carried out in many of these environments. And that's just simply because theory is very different from practice. So you might understand something via a standard, but when you go about testing that, you might actually end up with completely different results. So that completes our talk. If you have any questions, please let us know. And thank you very much for listening.